Title: The Game-Theoretic Foundations of Offline Rating in Persistent Sandbox Survival Games. A formal analysis of asymmetric information, dominance strategies, and mechanism design in virtual economies. In the ecology of persistent sandbox survival games, Rust, Ark, Survival Evolved, SCUM, the act of rating constitutes a formal strategic environment characterized by incomplete information, asymmetric presence, and high-stakes resource allocation. Within this environment, one strategic behavior has emerged as the dominant equilibrium: offline rating. This analysis synthesizes existing game-theoretic frameworks drawn from the work of Nash, Axelrod, Harsanyi, and others to examine how the structural conditions of these games transform offline rating into a rational, expected value maximizing strategy, and explores how mechanism design interventions such as offline raid protection attempt to shift this equilibrium. The foundational framework for understanding offline rating begins with the prisoner's dilemma, particularly in its repeated form. In a single interaction between two players, the dominant strategy is to defect. To raid offline yields maximum loot with minimal risk, while cooperation leaves one vulnerable to exploitation. Robert Axelrod's The Evolution of Cooperation from 1984 demonstrated that in iterated prisoners' dilemmas, cooperative equilibria can emerge through strategies like tit for tat, which rewards cooperation and punishes defection in future rounds. On a stable server with persistent populations, the shadow of the future, the expectation of continued interaction, enables cooperative norms. A player who offline raids today may find themselves targeted by a coalition tomorrow. Yet this equilibrium is fragile. Server populations are fluid, wipes reset social structures, and anonymity weakens the shadow of the future. When players cannot credibly commit to future interactions, the game collapses into a series of one-shot encounters, and defection once again becomes the dominant strategy. Offline raiding is fundamentally a game of incomplete information. The raider does not know whether the defender is online or offline, nor the precise distribution of defenses within the base. John Harsanyi's transformation, developed across a series of papers from 1967 to 1968, provides the formal apparatus for modeling such games. The defender's type, online or offline, is private information, and the raider forms beliefs based on available signals, the time of day, observed activity, and the configuration of external defenses. Offline raiding is a dominant strategy precisely because the raider can condition their attack on these beliefs. By waiting until the probability of the defender being online approaches zero, the raider eliminates the defender's strategy set entirely. A defender who is offline cannot repair walls, deploy traps, summon allies, or despawn loot. The game reduces from a dynamic conflict to a static resource extraction problem. This asymmetry of presence constitutes a structural advantage that no amount of in-game skill can overcome. John Nash's equilibrium concept, introduced in 1950, formalizes the outcome we observe in offline raiding-dominated servers. A Nash equilibrium is a strategy profile in which no player can improve their payoff by unilaterally changing their strategy. Because the defender cannot credibly commit to being online 24 hours a day, the raider's strategy of offline raiding dominates the alternative. The resulting Nash equilibrium is Pareto inferior. All players would be better off if no one offline raided, yet no individual player can deviate without suffering a competitive disadvantage. This is the tragedy of the commons transposed into the domain of virtual property rights. The decision to online raid to attack while the defender is present is best modeled as a war of attrition, a concept formalized by John Maynard Smith in 1974. In a war of attrition, two players incur costs over time, and the player willing to endure the longer cost wins the resource. Critically, the resource's value may be entirely consumed by the costs of the conflict itself. In an online raid, the defender can repair walls in real time, respawn repeatedly, deploy traps, summon allies, and despawn loot out of spite. The raider faces increasing costs with each rocket fired and each death requiring re-equipment. Rational raiders calculate expected value by weighing the total loot against the cost of explosives and gear likely to be lost. Because the defender's ability to repair and respawn drives down the probability of success while driving up the cost, the expected value of an online raid is often negative. Offline raiding bypasses this war entirely. If offline raiding emerges as a dominant strategy under the default rules, then altering the rules constitutes mechanism design, a field associated with Leonid Hurwicz in 1973 and later with Maskine and Meyerson. Offline raid protection, or ORP, is precisely such a mechanism. By artificially increasing structure durability when all authorized players are offline, ORP changes the underlying payoff structure. Before ORP, raiding an offline base yielded higher expected value than raiding an online base. After ORP, the increased breach cost may exceed the expected loot value, shifting the raider's dominant strategy. The mechanism aligns individual incentives with collective welfare by making the exploitative strategy economically irrational. However, ORP introduces perverse incentives. Players may log off intentionally to activate protection, requiring careful implementation with delay timers and activity thresholds. Players adapt to the threat of offline raiding through strategic deception. Decoy bases, empty structures designed to appear as primary bases, constitute a form of signaling. Vincent Crawford and Joel Sobel's model of strategic information transmission from 1982 distinguishes between cheap talk and costly signals. A decoy base is costly, requiring resources and time, which makes it a credible signal of poverty in theory. In practice, however, the signaling equilibrium breaks down when wealthy players also build decoys. When all types engage in deception, the signal ceases to convey information. Raiders respond by screening, investing in intelligence gathering to observe actual behavior rather than relying on static signals. Door camping, thermal scoping, and tracking activity patterns become the dominant methods of inference. The social dynamics of Rust servers labeling offline raiders as scummy, forming anti-Zerg coalitions, practicing retaliatory griefing are manifestations of the folk theorem in repeated games. Formalized by Drew Feudenberg and Eric Maskine in 1986, the folk theorem states that in infinitely repeated games with sufficiently patient players, cooperative equilibria can be sustained through punishment strategies. On stable servers with long time horizons, players can enforce cooperative norms. A player who offline raids can be punished by being targeted repeatedly or excluded from alliances. But when player turnover is high, when servers wipe weekly, when players rotate, the folk theorem's conditions fail. There is no future to punish in. The game reverts to a one-shot structure, and offline raiding re-emerges as the dominant strategy. Large groups Zergs occupy a unique position in the game-theoretic landscape. Maynard Olson's The Logic of Collective Action from 1965 explains why large groups can solve collective action problems that small groups cannot. Zergs achieve 24-hour presence through shift-based play, ensuring at least one player is always online. This neutralizes the asymmetry that makes offline raiding dominant for smaller groups. This creates a stratified equilibrium. Small groups and solo players, lacking the membership to maintain continuous presence, face a choice: accept vulnerability, form alliances, or leave the server. The presence of Zergs functions as a threshold, a concept explored by Thomas Schelling in his 1978 work Micromotives and Macrobehavior, beyond which smaller players cannot rationally compete. Despite the richness of this strategic environment, there exists no dedicated academic literature on offline raiding in survival games. Game studies research on griefing and toxicity rarely employs formal game theory. Security economics provides a parallel framework for understanding time-shifted attacks. Discussions of RAID protection appear in developer blogs but have not been formalized in peer-reviewed literature. A future contribution could formalize offline raiding as a game of incomplete information with a presence type, derive the conditions under which ORP restores cooperative equilibria, and empirically test these predictions using server-level data. Offline raiding in persistent sandbox survival games is not merely a symptom of toxicity. It is a rational response to structural conditions, asymmetric information, the impossibility of continuous presence, the absence of enforceable contracts, and the collapse of repeated game cooperation under population churn. The game-theoretic frameworks developed over the past 70 years reveal that what appears as a failure of player ethics is, in fact, a failure of institutional design. Interventions such as offline raid protection, carefully implemented, can shift the equilibrium toward more socially desirable outcomes. Rust and its counterparts serve as unintentional laboratories for game theory real-time environments where the predictions of Axelrod, Harsanyi, and Nash play out in sulfur explosions and sleeping bags, in doors left open and bases reduced to rubble.